G'day guys, this is just a little quick video looking at allulose. It's a new keto sweetener for the keto junk food junkies out there. So it's an alternative to stevia and xylitol and all these other erythritol and whatever else you'd like to under the sun. It's supposed to be the new holy grail of sweeteners for the junk food junkies out there in the keto low carb world. So let's take a bit of a look at that. Now I'm using a video recently that it was actually put out by Thomas Delaura. Now I'm not having a go at him in terms of I do sub to him, so it's not as if I'm deliberately going out of my way, but he sort of he promotes this sort of stuff because a lot of the products that he actually sells, like a lot of other people promote in the low carb community nowadays, they promote a lot of, the Diet Doctor and all that. They have a lot of, products nowadays that everybody's promoting. Good for them. But at the end of the day, they do overhype some of this stuff. And let's get rid of the hype and the BS. And let's just take a look a bit under the bonnet in that regard. So let me just share my screen. Okay, so let me just stop sharing and I'll re-share to put add the audio. And basically,
pee it out. That's what the science says about allulose.
So basically he says that the science actually says that you basically pee it out. And well, you don't pee all of it out. There's still a bit that does get in, but the majority of it, yes, in a sense. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have any physiological responses. But let's just move on in that regard. He does mention further down about the GLUT2 and 5 sort of receptors that this tends to occupy. So the transporting in of carbohydrates and all that seems to be slightly reduced because it's taking up that space. So he sort of puts that down that you could basically, have some cheats with this sort of stuff and have less of a glycemic shock to your system. The problem is all this does is promote the options of basically keeping the carb addiction, all that going. So it's not the sort of stuff that I, subscribe that let's have our cake and eat it and stuff like that. And yeah, that's basically, let's throw a whole lot of allulose in with the cake and let's just gorge ourselves on the cake. This ignores the ramifications of things like deuterium that are high. This is a highly processed product, so we'll have high deuterium. Plus the stuff that you're trying to mitigate, supposedly, will also have high deuterium. So in the end, yes, you may not get a big sugar spike, but you still get some deuterium and other, potential dysregulation, like all the other sugar alcohols cause. But the problem is we don't know enough. There's very little research. This is new, out there on the block. Now I'm going to show some research that he hasn't shown because he's showing a whole lot of favorable research and saying, oh, look at this, it's great, it does this and that. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but we'll just cover a few points.
You don't use it, you just pee it out. Allulose. It's taking over the keto world, it's taking over the alternative sweetener world, and it's pretty darn awesome stuff, and the science does back it up. Now, molecularly, it's super, super similar to sugar, very similar to sugar. And
that's the reason why it can actually bind to those, transporters. That's the reason. But it has difficulty actually getting into the system. So it ends up. But also that means that you will get more fermentation as a consequence because you'll get more of the other sugars if you take these sort of treat pathways into the gut, and that will cause far more fermentation. we will cover that shortly in a study that Thomas doesn't cover.
Chemically, it's what's called a monosaccharide, which is basically what sugar is too.
Basically.
So for all intents and purposes, the body kind of treats it like a sugar, except it doesn't utilize it. So you find it.
And that's true as well, as we said earlier.
In all kinds of keto treats. A lot of my favorite.
And that's it, in all kinds of keto treats. So basically he's promoting that sort of things. So I'm not going to go into all this sort of stuff. He talks here about, based on these results, determining that the caloric value of, and we're looking at this 0.04 kilocalories per gram, stuff like
calories per gram of allulose, practically nothing. But what was really interesting,
and what we're going to end up is with nutrient devoid foods promoted in the keto low carb community like these, which we're just going to be full of this sort of these sort of sweeteners, which basically is promoting a nutrient deficient approach, because people will jump onto these. I mean, the reality is we all have addictions and we all have issues with dealing with those addictions. And we all consume foods and we don't know enough about this sugar alcohol. We know other sugar alcohols cause all sorts of dysregulation and problems in the gut microbiome and all sorts of things. Now, apparently this doesn't. But remember, there's not much research, and all the research, as I've seen going along, even this study, which was a double blind, he doesn't show this study, which looks at fructose and allulose, because fructose is the key one that we're throwing in there. Let's not forget, you know, we're replacing fructose for allulose in a set. And this is a randomized control double blind. He doesn't look at this. And these guys just look at the conflict of interest page. Conflict of interest, it just goes on and on. All the food industry companies, you know, just look at it. Kellogg's, you know, you pick it, Unilever, you know, most of these studies out there is basically all these companies. And when you look at all these companies, it's just one level and one after another of conflict of interest. So keep that in mind. But let's go back.
Is in the world of artificial sweeteners or natural sweeteners or any alternative sweeteners, you usually see a fermentation in the gut, in the small intestine, which leads to gastric upset.
Did you hear what he said? I'll cover that in the last study. He said that you usually see gastric effects and, you know, discomfort and all that.
There was no fermenting of allulose in the gut. So
there was no fermenting of allulose in the gut. That's a big statement, especially when I've got this Korean study, which is gastrointestinal tolerance of D-Allulose in healthy young adults, a non-randomized controlled trial. So it's a trial on people that are not randomized, that all of them are getting the dose. Okay, let's look at what this study. D-Allulose recently received attention as a sugar substitute. However, there is currently no report regarding its association with gastrointestinal tolerance. So basically, most of the other studies and most of the other sort of stuff that the food industry is heavily, this is an alternative that the food industry wants to push, because they still want to push junk, nutrient devoid food. But they want to tell you they've got a new alcohol sugar now that you can actually take and fill. You can have their junk guilt-free. And so they're not looking at any of this sort of stuff. Why would they? It goes against their whole interests. They just want to compare it between the other sweeteners and all that. And is it better in preventing sugar getting into the bloodstream? Let's go on. Thus, we performed a GI tolerance test of D-Allulose in order to establish its daily acceptable intake levels. When the dose of D-Allulose was gradually increased in step of 0.1 grams per kilogram body weight to identify the maximum single dose for the occasional ingestion, no cases of severe diarrhea or GI symptoms were noted until the dose of 0.4 grams per kilogram body weight was reached. So severe symptoms of diarrhea were noted at a dose of 0.5 grams per kilogram. And similarly, the GI tolerance test did not show any incidence of severe GI until the dose of 0.5 grams was reached. So that's in terms of severe diarrhea. These are, you notice some differences between the two. A correlation analysis of GI tolerance for blah, 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 revealed significant higher frequency of symptoms of diarrhea. That's the p-value. So obviously the more in that direction it is. So it's not significantly, it's significant, but not significantly, associated. So, or with, in terms of the inference. Abdominal citation, so that's slightly less significant. Abdominal pain, slightly less. But there was some people after D-Allulose intake, increasing the total daily D-Allulose intake gradually to 1 gram per kilogram of body weight for regular ingestion resulted in incidents of severe nausea, abdominal pain, headaches, anorexia, and diarrhea symptoms. Based on these results, we suggest a single dose and maximum total daily intake to be basically in that lower sort of 0.4 grams. But the problem is, as we know historically, people basically are not going to stick to low doses. They will increase their doses because there's a lot of people out there that are just junkies. And if they've got an artificial sweetener that basically can, and there are different genetics as well in the terms of tolerance. I'm not going to cover the whole thing. I just wanted to basically show that there are recorded risks. It's not as basically, Thomas says, there is no, as he said, no issue whatsoever. That's wrong. And looking at the American studies and a lot of industry-based studies and supported by industry, obviously there's no problem whatsoever. It's the new great thing. Why would there be a problem? But when you look at independent studies of like the Koreans, go away, retract, I'll go back to the Korean study, if this will let me. And we go down here. As you can see, conflict of interest. The authors declare no conflict of interest. South Korea. So they basically don't have any conflict of interest. I'm not agreeing with everything that people say or put out there or that. So, but I'm saying that, these people have identified that at a certain dose, and the reality is, as this sweetener gets put into all sorts of things, cakes and beverages and all sorts of things, do you think people are going to have the low dose? They'll be consuming all this sort of junk treats and stuff like that throughout the day, having snacks, having drinks with this stuff in it, because they're junkies in sweetness and all that. And they will get these slight effects and they won't know what's causing it. And they'll be wondering, they'll think it's the keto diet, not the sweetener, or it's something that they've done wrong, or some other bloody bizarre thing that they've come up with in their little feeble mind. So that's what we'll basically get and end up getting a lot of that sort of junk in that regard. So keep that in mind. I'm not going to go through the whole video. People can go and take a look at it themselves and make up their own mind. My opinion is that going down the path of junk food isn't going to help you in the long run. Feeding the addictions and just thinking, oh, I can cheat constantly is not going to help. You know, I'm not saying that I'm perfect. I mean, you guys know, you know, my Saturdays, I have a low carb, you know, with some xylitol and stuff like that, sweetened, you know, ice cream and stuff like that. So I'm not perfect. But the danger here is that people will see this and go, ooh, this isn't a big issue, so I can go really hard on this and go crazy. That's the danger that I fear. And before I forget, there was one other point that I did want to actually look at, and that was the insulin response. So because basically Thomas basically ignores and says, oh, there's not an issue, because remember in the beginning he actually says glucose and insulin, not anything really noticeable, is what the actual approach is. Now let me just share this from that first study, which is an industry study. This is not even, you know, that's the industry study, and I'll basically remind you guys. So let me just share that again. So remember, this is the first one. There, the double-blind, randomized, acute feeding controlled, which is the first one. And this is the insulin information. As you can see, I'm just highlighting, you know, no deception here. And you can actually see here's fructose, different amounts in the control. And then here's the sort of control and allulose, and we're talking about carbohydrate here. And as you can see, here's the different fructose response. So in comparison, and here's the non-fructose response, and they're not very dissimilar. Yes, it is slightly lower. It's closer to the control down here, about 700. Okay, that's plasma insulin. But generally speaking, in terms of that, and that's basically on some carbohydrates and stuff like that. And you can actually see the insulin response. It's not like when you're on a low carbohydrate diet that it's very low in the much lower levels. So there's not much difference as far as I'm statistically significant. There isn't, you know, if it was down here like half or whatever, yes, it'd be statistically significant. So as you can see, the insulin response is very similar to fructose. So, you know, in that regard, you know, the way it responds in the body is no different than fructose. The only difference is that it seems to basically occupy the transporters, which means that probably slightly less sugar goes into the system, which is probably has a positive effect in that regard in terms of blood glucose. So on that point, I agree, the blood glucose point is probably beneficial. You know, it probably improves for the junkies out there on the SAD diet. It's probably going to be an improvement. If this sweetener is put in all their junk food, it's probably going to be an improvement for those people because they're going to get less glucose going in, but then they may become more ravenous. And this may be the whole strategy of the industry. Somebody is constantly, you know, why are they going back every 2 hours to feed? Because their glucose is going low. So if this is having the same insulin type response and you're not getting enough glucose in, isn't that going to potentially make you feed more often, even more often than you're feeding today? So there could be a negative effect there. This is a conjecture from me, but you know, if it's got a similar insulin response, but it's impeding some of the glucose to get in, so you're having less of your glucose hit, that means you're probably getting energy enough for 1 hour rather than 2 hours. So could you be back at the bowl, you know, at the trough within 1 hour? and actually rather than have 6 meals a day, have 12 meals a day. You know, this could be the downside. Now, for the keto people, it's just a treat. You know, they're already in a ketotic state. So for them, there's not going to be this energy spiking issue. But for people that are potentially on low carb, which are not necessarily, or people that are not completely keto adapted or whatever, taking this sort of stuff could be creating these, you know, issues and potentially making them, you know, consume far more than they would normally. Potentially, especially on the sad dieters, it could actually make them eat more long term, like we've found with a lot of other sweeteners that end up making people eat more and be more ravenous. So that could be the downside of this, and potentially the sad dieters could end up even worse off than currently. So we don't know because we don't have enough science, don't have enough research, and usually when these new sweeteners come out, we don't find out until down the track when the train wreck really hits. So giving you a bit of thought about the risks that exist with these type of sweeteners. It's up to you what you do with your body. Mine isn't sort of either medical advice or dietary advice to people. I just provide you with the best science, and my take on it, and what you do with that is up to you. But I think I would give these sort of things a miss. You know, that's my take anyway. Anyway, see yous.